That's right. That's right. Our next speaker is making his second debut on the Emerge stage. He was our keynote in 2015, and he's been a dear personal friend and mentor of mine. One of the greatest evangelists of our time for emerging ecosystems like ours. A man that literally brought America online and has been leading the charge of the rise of the rest. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming our next speaker, AOL Co-founder, Revolution CEO and Chairman, and my dear friend, Steve Case, and CNBC's Deirdre Bosa.
I like that. Literally brought America online. Not the first time you've heard it.
Not the first time I've heard it, but I always enjoy it. It's a nice thing to say.
Well, I am amazed. This room has continued to stay packed all day. And I was just talking to Felice, and it's amazing because I was here 3 years ago, and the crowd has just grown and grown. And I'd like to say that you were out of the Bay Area before it was cool and trendy to do so. Does the crowd, how are you feeling being here and seeing sort of a packed room, the rise of Miami tech?
No, it's great. No, and I remember, as you said, being here in 2015, it was a good-sized crowd, but not as big as it is now. And we were back about three and a half years ago with our Rise of the Rest bus and spent a good bit of time in the area. And it's, in some ways, a perfect example of the rise of the rest in a rising city, that most people 10 years ago would not have thought of Miami as a tech hub.
Even 5 years ago, right?
Even 5 years ago, but it started building and some things started happening, and the Medina family creating Emerge and kind of investing in early on, almost a decade ago, and starting to build out the ecosystem. And then some accelerant in terms of a mayor really focused on this, and some sectors that really got a lot of attention in the pandemic, which then led some people to take a step back and rethink exactly how they want to live and how they want to work and where they want to live and where they want to work. And that has opened up a lot of opportunities for a lot of these rise of the rest cities, and Miami is a perfect example of really building on that momentum, going from a situation where for many decades there was sort of a brain drain of young people leaving because there was not enough opportunity, at least in the innovation startup sector here. They felt they had to be in San Francisco or New York or Boston or some other place. Slowing that brain drain, creating a boomerang of people returning, new people kind of opening their eyes to the possibilities of that, which then led to more capital flowing, which then led to more companies starting and more companies scaling, and getting that increasing returns dynamic going. So it's been great to see that trajectory. What we're hoping and frankly expecting is this story of what's happened in Miami is really going to be the story all across America.
Right.
It's not just one or two or three new startup cities, it's dozens of new startup cities. We now have invested through our Rise of the Rest fund in 100 cities. And people are going to be astonished over the next decade how many really significant companies aren't just in Miami, but also in Columbus and Indianapolis and Detroit and New Orleans and Atlanta and Denver and Houston and Minneapolis and lots of cities. I'm always reluctant to even mention some because
you're going to have to name all.
It's like a parent being asked who their favorite child is, and mention one or two and say, "What about me?"
I was going to ask you, besides Miami, of course, what is the city you're most excited about, or did you just say you definitely can't do that?
I can't do that.
If you had to?
I can't do that. I just can't do that.
You love all your children equally.
I love all I want all my children to have the opportunity to be successful. I want all the cities that we're trying to champion to have that similar opportunity. But in all seriousness, it really isn't about one or two. We did something with Forbes a few years ago, a list of 10 rising cities, and kind of at the time that based on a number of different dynamics. This is not about a few cities. It's about a few dozen cities. I actually got into a discussion. We hosted a virtual event last year with Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, and we're talking about Rise of Rest, some of the dynamics. I made this point that I thought it'd go from a few cities to a few dozen cities, and Brian said, probably correctly, I think it's a few hundred cities, not just in this country, but around the world. We're really seeing innovation and talent and capital disperse, and that's going to accelerate.
He's helping to make that happen,
Absolutely.
right? Because he says that Airbnb is now going to work in this hybrid work environment. And you've actually seen that in their numbers, is that the number of bookings for longer term stays is increasing on the platform. Go back then to the pandemic. Did that surprise you, or did it sort of accelerate things in a way that you couldn't have even predicted?
I think it would have accelerated ways I couldn't have predicted. I expected, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, probably did ask me on the stage 7 years ago, it would be a slow build, but at some point, these things hit a tipping point and really accelerate. We saw that with the internet. When we got started with AOL in 1985, only 3% of people were online. They're only online 1 hour a week. So not many people used it. Not many people thought the internet ever would amount to anything. It took us, almost a decade before people finally decided it was a good idea, and it went from nobody knowing about it or caring about it or using it to everybody needing to be connected, and that was the late 90s when things really accelerated. The rise of rest I thought would be similar. It would slowly build, and then there would be a tipping point. Initially, I thought that would be a tipping point in different cities when companies broke out and had great success, almost this concept of a tentpole company that then led people in that city to believe, like, whoa, I didn't know we could do that.
Right.
And so I thought it would be more city specific. What the pandemic did was create a much broader, really global discussion around work and life and how do you strike the right balance, and gave people more flexibility in terms of where they wanted to live. And that did lead people initially, most probably thought it'd be only for a few weeks, maybe a few months, to go live someplace else. And some of those people said, come to think of it, I want to stay here. And I'll either continue to work for the company I'm already working for, but doing it remotely, or maybe I now see some things happening in the city that I didn't realize was happening. And so maybe I'll join one of those companies. Maybe I'll start my own company. And so I do think, even though the pandemic obviously been terrible in many, many respects, if you're looking for a positive silver lining, it's this idea that it's sort of this shake the snow globe moment is accelerating the growth of a lot of rising cities. I said at the beginning, Miami clearly is a great example of that, but there are dozens of others.
It's fascinating that you relate it to sort of Web 1.0, and you saw a few people get online, and then you saw many, many. But what emerged from that was a few dominant platforms, right? Do you think that that's going to happen with the rise of the rest? Do you think that there's going to be pockets or cities that become dominant?
Sure, there will be some cities. I think our basic argument is that every entrepreneur everywhere should have a shot at the American dream, irrespective of where they live. So how do you create strong startup ecosystems and access to capital and connectivity with bigger companies, universities, in as many places as possible? We think that's a good thing for those entrepreneurs. I think that's a good thing for those cities. We think it's a good thing for the country, creating more opportunity for more people in more places. For sure, some cities will end up rising and being larger, probably less dominant in the next 25 years than the last 25 years. The data right now of the last decade, 75% of venture capital went to 3 states. California, New York, and Massachusetts, 75%. California alone, 50%. That's dominant. And I don't think Silicon Valley is going to fall, but I think as other cities rise, its relative dominance will diminish. And it will become a more inclusive innovation economy. But yes, just as you're seeing in Seattle, which 40 years ago was a struggling city. The industries that had driven its success were struggling. And a lot of people said, I don't think Seattle has a future. Well, 2 guys happen to be born and raised in Seattle, Bill Gates and Paul Allen. They actually started Microsoft in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and moved to Seattle because they wanted to go home. That's why. Well, Microsoft was pretty successful and helped build Seattle as a tech ecosystem. Amazon. There's only one reason Amazon is headquartered in Seattle. Jeff Bezos was sitting in his little hedge fund office in New York City and said, I have this idea of starting this bookseller, internet bookseller. I bet I could pick off some engineers from Microsoft. So he got in his car and moved to Seattle, specifically because Microsoft was there and there was talent there. And the success of Microsoft and then Amazon and also in other sectors, Starbucks and Costco and other things have led that to being a leading startup ecosystem, and the momentum begets momentum. And so some cities will have more of that than others, for sure. It will tier, but every city will be, or almost every city, we think will be stronger 25 years from now, backing more startups, creating more jobs, driving more economic growth.
You were kind of diplomatic when you talked about California, maybe San Francisco in particular. You said that it was just going to be less dominant. But I wonder if you think that there are things that the government there that are happening in California that is making it a less attractive place for startups these days.
Sure. Obviously, there some people have left because of different concerns, either around safety or taxes or different kinds of things. It depends on the person, depends on the company, depends on the sector, and so forth. But there's some of that going on. I think overwhelmingly, California broadly and Silicon Valley for sure is a wonderful startup ecosystem. It is, there's sense of possibility, the amount of capital there, the connectivity, the network effects that exist there are strong and will remain strong. And really, it's one of the things I love about Silicon Valley is unlike many places we visited with Rise of the Rest on our bus tour, in Silicon Valley, if people hear a pitch, an idea for a startup, their mind goes to why that might be successful. In many parts of the country, perhaps even most parts of the country, people go to why it might fail. They focus too much on the risk factors, not what might be possible, what might go wrong as opposed to what might go right. So I think that will continue. So I'm bullish on Silicon Valley. I'm just making the argument that based on what we've seen and what we think will happen over the next 10 or 20 years, many cities will rise and be launching some of the big companies of the future, some of the industries of the future, some of the Fortune 500 companies of the future, and it will be less dominant than it has been.
Do you think 10 years from now, the big tech companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Alphabet, Apple, they are going to be the dominant platforms?
Some will, some won't. The history here, including my own experience with AOL, at one point, AOL, in the late 90s, half of all the internet traffic in the United States went through AOL. Today, not so much. It was, some would say the dominant company. When we proposed a merger with Time Warner, AT&T and Microsoft and others marched on Washington to block it. Rupert Murdoch sued us over antitrust issues. He said nobody can compete with, because AOL dominates the internet. Well, that happened for a while, and then for a host of reasons, some macro competitive factors, some internal mistakes that were made. It went from being the dominant one to being kind of an also-ran. Some of the companies you mentioned will still be in the lead. Others will fall by the wayside. This is what happens in terms of innovation and creative destruction. I would add, though, in some of those instances, and I wrote about this 5 years ago when I wrote the book, The Third Wave, that some of these big tech companies need to be a little more respectful of the policy process and politics and how people are feeling about them, because there is a backlash that started brewing a number of years ago and has gotten more significant. That does also create some risk for them, including some risk of breakups or more regulations or things like that. But the main thing that will impact them is somebody will come up with a better way to do this or that or the other, and ultimately some of the leaders will diminish. Some may even go out of business. Others will continue to flourish. Microsoft is one of the most valuable companies in the world, and most people 20 years ago thought that other new companies focused on enterprise software and operating systems and so forth, likely would take them out. They executed well.
Has Microsoft surprised you that it's been able to regain that?
Yeah, no, it's always been a great company. We competed directly against them for many years. I was scared of them, and they particularly in the last decade, have under the leadership of Satya, have done a great job of building a very significant, very valuable company, but also being partly because they had significant antitrust problems 20 plus years ago, being more respectful, and as a result, they're not quite in the crosshairs like some other big companies are.
Like some other big companies, I feel like you're kind of subtweeting one in particular. When you talk about regulation and maybe losing some trust, Facebook, do you think that they're, or Meta now, is in danger of losing that sort of dominant place, especially to competitors like TikTok? And you had a front row to this, so what do CEOs or founders have to be careful of?
Well, they need to keep innovating. They need to keep, it's the basic stuff. They need to keep innovating to make sure whatever they're doing is better than what anybody else is doing. They need to continue to be a magnet for talent, attracting and keeping people and creating the right culture. In many cases, particularly in this next wave of innovation, sectors like healthcare and many others, they need to be forming strategic partnerships because it's more of a systems problem. It's not what any one technology can do or any one company can do. It's much more of a systems issue. So partnerships become more important. Can they establish those partnerships, and can they navigate some of these policy issues so they can convince people, including governments, not just our country, but around the world, that what they're doing is a positive force in society, so people are more likely to let them run as opposed to be worried about some of the unintended negative consequences, and that leads people to want to intervene.
We talk about the regulatory issues so often on CNBC, also in the context in that shareholders just haven't really cared about it. So all of these lawsuits that have been piling up, it feels like the shareholders don't take them seriously because share prices don't reflect that kind of pressure. What do you make of that? Do you think that's complacency? Do you think that the regulatory pressures are not that great because DC may not be able to get it together to actually enact anything?
No, I think they're a greater threat, but I'm not surprised that shareholders often view some of the challenges as not that significant until they are significant. Nobody thought, again, 20 plus years ago, nobody thought Microsoft would have an issue until they did have an issue. The government sued them and tried to break them up because a bunch of things they did. So it's one of these things that it's fine until it's not fine. And there will be some of those dynamics that kick in the coming years for I think, some of those companies.
Are there real antitrust issues when you're traveling all around the country and you're listening to startups and they have to compete against these platforms that are getting more and more services and using what some might call their monopolies to win, to eat their lunch? How much is that a concern? Do you think that regulation needs to be enacted? What would that look like to you?
Well, it's a mix. I think the argument that the large tech companies make in Washington and other places is in a global battle for innovation with China and other countries that are making significant investments in a lot of core technologies, AI and other things, that you should not constrain what we're able to do. China's actually doing the opposite, really kind of further empowering their biggest companies. Now, granted, the government has significant control over those big companies, but they're essentially saying the big should get bigger. In this country, I think the core principle, and it ties in with your question, is how do you make sure entrepreneurs have a shot? If they do have a better idea, they have a shot at taking that to market and making that successful. And that's when companies get in trouble if it looks like they can't be successful, or only get so far, and either one of those big companies will acquire them or they'll crush them. And so that's, I think, where the regulatory scrutiny is going to come in the coming years. It's not just kind of letting them run because they're good for our global competitiveness, but making sure they're not doing things that undermine potentially entrepreneurs in this room in terms of their ability to compete, whether it be in e-commerce or in search or social media or any of these sectors.
I'm trying to see what time is here. Okay. I think we're sitting in the wrong seat. I still have a number of topics that I want to get through with you. One is what we're seeing right now in the public and private markets. You have a few companies in your portfolio that have gone public, and it's been a hard market. You had Sweetgreen, Big Commerce. I can't remember another one, but
DraftKings, Clear.
70 to 80, 65% off their peaks. What are you hearing from your portfolio companies right now about going public? Is the IPO window closed for them?
It's essentially closed. I mean, the IPO window, I've been doing this now for a while. There's moments where it's relatively easy to go public, assuming you've got a business that's ready to go public and so forth. And there are times when it's hard. And the investor psychology on this can shift quite dramatically. Last year was, the IPO window was wide open. A lot of companies went public. This year, I wouldn't say it's completely closed, but it's much harder. So some companies will go public, but most will be waiting for that moment. And that moment usually happens when a very significant company goes public and proves that it's doable and they get a good valuation and the aftermarket trading is strong and things like that, then a lot of people who were planning to go public, many have already confidentially filed to go public, suddenly a lot of things would happen. So whether that kind of reopens in the summer or the fall, different people have different theories. But certainly there's been a pause in terms of new IPOs.
Who do you think that might be a candidate? Sort of a big name to show that the IPO window might be open once again. There's so many companies.
There's a bunch of companies, including a couple of companies that are in our portfolio that might be some of those, but I therefore will not mention them because that will just create havoc for them. But I think it's for now it's more difficult, and also I would say, relatedly, because of this kind of retrenching of the public markets and resetting of valuations, the later stage private round are taking longer to get done. Valuations are somewhat lower. I think last year people were thinking in a maybe a too optimistic view that things would always keep going up in value, and obviously there are cycles, and we're in a cycle where there has been a correction. So the companies that do need to raise capital that were thinking of going public, some of those are raising capital in the private markets, but usually at valuations that are a little bit less than they might have expected 6 months ago, and in some cases down rounds.
Yeah, which is important for their employee retention and recruitment, right? Is having a valuation that will be attractive if you're paying your employees in equity. Because we do have a few minutes left, I'm so curious. I know it's a topic that you guys have probably been reading all about. We've been talking about it on CNBC. But when you talk about companies that can't innovate any longer, I got to ask you about Twitter. Is Twitter innovating, do you think?
Oh, you're trying to pull me into the Elon.
I am. I didn't have to say his name. You said it.
No, I think I have a great respect for Twitter. I met the founders really early on. They actually, some of the core technology they said was kind of building off something AOL did with what we called AIM, the AOL Instant Messenger, and essentially a status message. They said, let's take that status message and make it permanent, and then people could search on those status messages, and it started in sort of silly ways, but it ended up becoming this massive global platform, and arguably the major force in terms of media, journalism, things like that, in terms of how a lot of people are essentially getting their news. So it's been a huge success and continues to be a very significant and valuable company.
How do you define success and value? Influence?
The reach they have in terms of users and the value, and in fact, lately call it $40 billion, which is pretty good for a company that didn't even exist 15 years ago. So I think they're successful in a lot of different ways. Could they innovate faster? I'm sure. I've been talked to them recently. I obviously don't know what their product roadmap is, but as a Twitter user, who was one of the early Twitter users over a decade ago, sure, there's some things that I could see being done differently and better, and that obviously is the view that Elon has in terms of I think there's some things that could be done differently. Exactly how this plays out, I think it's going to probably take a little more time than people think, and there are probably going to be some new wrinkles that develop. So it certainly gives CNBC a lot to talk about.
It certainly does. I guess then, would Elon Musk be good or bad for Twitter?
Could be good, could be bad. Depends on what happens and what he decides to do and what the company decides to do. I certainly see the bull case for he's among America's greatest entrepreneurs, maybe the greatest entrepreneur in the last couple of decades, and having somebody with that who's done such revolutionary things in cars and space and other sectors, focusing on any business, but certainly something like Twitter could be a huge positive. There are others who are concerned that some of his approaches, including how he personally uses kind of Twitter, maybe is not necessarily the best thing for that platform and might lead to further, going back to your earlier questions, further kind of regulatory scrutiny, other kinds of things. So there are pluses and minuses, as there always are with any situation like that. So the question ultimately is how, what the company thinks is the best path forward, or how, what he decides to do personally. And I think we probably won't know in days or weeks, but likely we'll know in months.
It's hard for anyone to know because it would require reading Elon Musk's mind, and that is a difficult thing. He's tweeting, all sorts of things throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting though, because you were at the forefront at Web 1.0, and now everyone, especially here, is talking Web 3.0, even talking about open sourcing Twitter.
Right.
And a lot of folks like to say that it's like the early days of the internet. You're going to have a lot that go bust, but you're going to have these big companies that come out of it that are the future platforms and technology. Do you agree with that?
Sure.
How are you
But
looking
first
at
of all, I have to correct your hypothesis. I was not Web 1.0, I was Web 0. Because we started AOL a decade before the web was even invented. And actually, when we started AOL, it was still illegal for consumers and businesses to be on the internet. In the mid-'80s, it restricted to government agencies and educational institutions. There were a bunch of companies doing what was then called online services and video text and teletext and so forth. That then kind of led to the opening up of the commercialization of the internet. Even when AOL went public in 1992, the web still had not been invented. It was just coming into being at that time, later that year, and mostly the next year. Netscape hadn't been invented. So there was a bunch of things so I think of Web 1 is really that era when the internet was fully commercialized and the World Wide Web was launched. So we saw some things for a number of years before that. But to your question, yes, what generally happens is in the earliest stage, including in the earliest days of AOL, as I said before, most people did not know or care what was happening, wasn't really paying attention. And then it starts getting some traction, and then it starts getting a lot of enthusiasm, which leads to a lot of investments and a lot of startups. And of course, many, maybe even most of those will fail. But equally, obviously, some will rise up and become the leading companies. And we're in another phase of that now, where a number of things are happening. And the excitement about that, including here at Emerge, is intoxicating. But some things will work and some won't. And some things will start one way and end up another way. And some companies that now look promising will fail. And some companies that now look sketchy will succeed. This is the nature of what happens in innovation.
Any learnings that you can apply from the early internet days to what we're seeing now in the crypto and Web3 space?
I think at the core, it's how do you focus, particularly in the areas we focused around AOL, around consumers, is how do you make sure you really do have something that is, in our case, easy to use and useful and fun and affordable? How do you win on that level and really have something that people want to use, have the level of convenience and transparency and trust and so forth that people want to have, and recognize, to your other question, that things will evolve and that some things that look obvious now will turn out to not really work out, and you have to keep kind of looking at that periphery and trying to figure out what's going to emerge. And then you'll also have this dynamic right now. The focus of Web3 is, I think, a overly broad category now, because there are a lot of things that people put into that bucket. But at the core, a lot of the focus is around decentralization, and we've seen that ebb and flow as well, from central to decentral to central to decentral to lots of little things to some big things, and no doubt we'll see that evolution happen again.
How long do you think it's going to take us to get there? How long this shakes out?
These things usually are a decade or so in terms of, so some things will happen sooner in terms of some early wins and some immediate losses in terms of some things working, some things not working. But in terms of the broader societal and kind of industry impact, probably will take more like a decade. I know that's not helpful to CNBC because you have to break the news every day, but sometimes things take a while before it's really clear how they're going to settle. Even AOL, going back to my own experience, it took us, as I recall, 9 years from the time we started to get 1 million subscribers. And then a couple of years later, we're adding 1 million subscribers a month. So, sometime in that first decade, we struggled. We almost went out of business a couple of times, had to go through layoffs, running out of money and so forth. And what later seemed obvious, was not obvious at the time. So these things, I often think of the AOL journey as a sort of a 10-year in the making overnight success. We were slogging away for 10 years, and then finally kind of it arrived. So these things often take longer, and particularly when there's systems level innovation happening, which require partnerships, where there's policy, sometimes changes in policy that need to be put in place. Those things do take longer than an app in the App Store that could be launched tomorrow and spread virally next week.
And these ideas, what we've been talking about, it's nice to have this time because even when we have a 5-year well-versed in the 5-6 minute kind of rapid fire CNBC interview, it can be hard to get these concepts across. So even we're using YouTube interviews to have longer discussions, which can sometimes be more helpful. But this was a great start, and you can understand too why you rise of the rest. You need to see these companies and these centers being built. It's been amazing to be here in Miami, and you're here for another day or so. Is that right?
Here tomorrow as well.
And you have
Including doing CNBC.
Yeah,
tomorrow.
he's coming on tomorrow. He's getting ready. He's preparing me for it.
No, let's end where we started, which is what's happening in Miami is remarkable, and it's the work of some pioneers who believed that a decade ago that there was a potential for Miami to rise as a startup hub when most people in the country, and indeed most people in Miami, didn't really believe, but they stuck with it and launched things like Emerge, and then kept building from that, and then you started having some successes and more successes, and you started getting more capital, and you started getting all that increasing returns dynamic, and then did benefit because of the pandemic, as we talked about before, in terms of some people moving here, and Miami kind of becoming more noticed and focusing on some sectors like crypto, and even having mayors here today and tomorrow to talk about that. It's exactly what should happen, and should happen in dozens of cities.
Yeah.
That's really what we're trying to champion with Rise the Rest. How do we create that dynamic in as many places as possible, that launches as many companies as possible, that create as many jobs as possible, and drives as much economic growth as possible, and collectively perhaps has a role to play in knitting together a very divided country, and collectively also has the potential to ensure that America remains the most innovative entrepreneurial nation. 250 years ago, America itself was just a startup and almost didn't make it. Almost didn't make it. And now the leader of the pack. How do we remain the leader of the pack? And it requires entrepreneurs to believe in ideas that most people think are crazy or impossible, and cities and people in those communities to believe in those entrepreneurs and back and support those entrepreneurs and give them a shot. And if we give enough people, enough places a shot, I think we can transform the innovation economy in this country and be a stronger country and a more united country. So it's not just about any particular startup. There's a broader idea here that I think we all should be paying attention to.
Well, that is a wonderful note to end on. America is a startup. I can't see the clock, so I have no idea if we've gone way over.
We're doing good.
I think you can see it, so you're going to
Exactly. We're 45 seconds over, so.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you guys so much.